What's the hardest thing about writing? Well, it's getting started. Maybe you're having a hard time coming up with a story idea, or you're stuck on where to take your story next. If you want a way into a story or a way through, I have 9 story starters to help you. This free PDF is full of story seeds and prompts to get you going. To download your 9 story starters, go to nancypanuccio.com/start. That's Nancy with an I, Panuccio with 2 C's, nancypanuccio.com/start. Most stories can do fine with launching the story with a first chapter. However, in a novel where we're being brought into a world we're not familiar with, for example, a world with genetically recreated dinosaurs, a prologue can help us absorb what follows without being constantly bombarded with exposition or backstory. Writer Unleashed is for you, a writer who has a story you want to bring onto the page and into the hearts and minds of readers. I'm Nancy Panuccio, writer, editor, and writing coach, and each week we'll explore techniques, mindsets, and inspiration for writing stories readers can't put down. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now let's begin. Does your story need a prologue? Will it hurt your story? Should you remove or rewrite the one you've already written? And how do you write a great prologue that gives us just enough information so we can absorb the rest of your story? Some writers resist prologues. They think it's an industry no-no. Other writers think it's a requirement. But a common mistake writers make with prologues is writing one which has no substantial relationship to the main story. This is why publishers dismiss the whole manuscript without turning the page. That's what makes a prologue a no-no, not the prologue itself, but the execution of it. Now, I am not pro-prologue. I'm not here to convince you to write one. Some books need at least a preliminary scene or scenes that helps the reader comprehend the story moving forward and helps you from tangling up the opening scenes with lots of information and exposition. So if you're having trouble weaving in necessary information in your main story and the world of your story is complex, you may want to consider a prologue. Now, not all stories need a prologue. There are probably more reasons not to have a prologue than there are to have one, and we'll get to that. But some stories do benefit from a prologue, especially when the main plot is complex and there's lots of background information the reader needs to be introduced to in order to understand and enjoy the story. So in this episode, I'm going to help you decide if your story could benefit from a prologue. I'll talk about 4 different types of prologues, and then I'll give you some tips to write a prologue that serves your story and doesn't work against it. Now, before we dive in, I want to distinguish prologues from forewords, prefaces, and introductions, all which appear before chapter 1. What is a foreword? A foreword is an introductory section of a book written by someone other than the author. The writer of the foreword is usually a well-known author or a New York Times best-selling author who's praising the book. It's an endorsement that can help a reader decide that the book is worth reading. A preface is written by the author, and it tells us how the novel came into being and what motivated the author to write the story. For example, in Watership Down, Richard Adams' preface talks about how when his two girls were little and they went on these long car trips, they'd ask him to tell them stories. Some stories were the tried and true, Cinderella, for example, but some of them he just made up. And then on a particularly long drive where they traveled over 100 miles, they asked their father for a really long story they hadn't heard before, and he started spontaneously improvising. Once upon a time, there were two rabbits named Hazel and Fiver. So, a preface is a story about the genesis of the novel written by the author. And then we have the introduction, which is less common but serves a different purpose than a prologue. In fiction, the introduction may or may not be part of the story itself, but it is related to the content of your story. It can provide context or primus for the main action. Jurassic Park starts with an introduction, followed by a prologue. The introduction gives us the overall context. The novel is about genetically recreated dinosaurs and how they wreak havoc in an amusement park. The introduction introduces us to the biotechnical company InGen, which we'll see again in the prologue and in the story. It's factual in tone. There's no character perspective, and it sets up the fallout of the commercialization of genetic engineering and how the scientists and all those involved have a stake in the commercialization of biotechnology and how there's no oversight among these scientists. So it doesn't tell us anything about the story per se, but it gives us context for what follows. And then we have the prologue. A prologue is a dramatized scene or event that's outside the scope of your main storyline that helps us understand what follows. So we have a foreword, a preface, an introduction, and a prologue. Your story may not need any of these. Your story may not need a prologue. Most stories can do fine with launching the story with a first chapter. However, in a novel where we're being brought into a world we're not familiar with, for example, a world with genetically recreated dinosaurs, a prologue can help us absorb what follows without being constantly bombarded with exposition or backstory. So let's dig in. What's the purpose of a prologue? The purpose of a prologue is to give the reader necessary information to help them comprehend and navigate the rest of the book. This can include background information on characters. It can include events that took place before the story begins. It can include information that establishes the setting of the story or establishes the main story question. A prologue is typically used in novels, but I've seen memoir writers use prologues too. Lucy Greeley's autobiography of a face starts with a prologue. A prologue gives the reader crucial information they'll need to navigate the rest of the story, and it's in the same writing style or voice of the story. It's usually written from a character's point of view. It may be your main character's perspective. It could also be another character who brings a different perspective to the story. It may even be a minor character who won't appear in the main storyline. Bobby Carter from Jurassic Park only appears in the prologue, but her perspective is essential to set up and foreshadow what happens next. Your prologue may be in a different timeline. It could be in the deep past, thousands of years ago, or it could be a flash forward like in One True Thing by Anna Quinlan. But what makes it a prologue rather than a first chapter is that without it, the reader's understanding of what happens in the rest of the story will be compromised. And then you'll have to dump all that information in your early chapters, which throws the reader out of the story. Now, a prologue is not mandatory. Don't write a prologue just because you think you're supposed to have one. So here are reasons not to write a prologue. Because you think it's a requirement to set mood, tone, and atmosphere, to explain what your story is about, or just to establish setting. Your prologue may do all those things, but they're not enough to make a prologue worth your reader's while. Mood, tone, world building, and atmosphere can and should be worked into the fabric of your story. And you want to leave some lingering questions for the reader so they keep turning the page. A prologue is not an exposition dump. It's dramatized and structured like any other scene or chapter. It doesn't give everything away. It has conflict, suspense, and it whets the reader's appetite for more. It's not just for world building or to set mood, atmosphere, or just to provide information. It may do all those things, but its primary purpose is to give readers contextual information they need before they get to chapter 1, and it should entice them to keep reading. So when might you consider using a prologue? Number 1, it's far beyond the scope of your main storyline, and it's crucial for the reader to understand it. For example, let's say your story takes place in a setting or time period or world beyond your reader's reality. It's a wholly imagined world, or it's one that they may not be familiar with. For example, a historical novel. You may be creating a world that the reader has no context for. Maybe the world of your story is entirely imagined by you. So you've made up this world with its own laws, its own rules, maybe even a different physical world. Maybe it's set in some imagined future. There's some realm beyond the world as your reader knows it. This is information your reader must be introduced to and absorb in order to understand this world, the culture and the rules and the laws and how this world operates. So it's beyond the scope of your main storyline, and the story won't make sense without a prologue. So number 1, it's beyond the scope of your main storyline, and number 2, the story won't make sense without a prologue. And number 3, you should consider a prologue if working this information into your story confuses your main storyline. It tangles up your plot and feels burdensome and unnatural to weave in, and it winds up being too much information packed in, especially in the early chapters, in an attempt to give the reader essential information they need to take in the rest of the story. Now, if it can be easily worked into your main story, you probably don't need a prologue. But if it's information that the reader must know and it can't be easily worked into your main story, you might want to consider writing a prologue. Okay, let's look at 4 different types of prologues: background prologues, alternate point of view prologues, flash forwards, and thematic prologues. And then I'll give you tips for writing a prologue. Prologue number 1 is the background prologue. This prologue sets the stage for your novel. A background prologue is useful if the world of your novel is very different from our own. Let's say you're writing science fiction or fantasy or historical fiction. This sort of prologue can be used to establish your story setting and culture and its rules in detail so we can understand the main action better. You don't want to thrust your reader unprepared into a world that's alien to them, because then your opening chapters will be weighed down with all this awkward exposition that pulls the reader out of the main story and confuses them. Sometimes a prologue may be set centuries or miles apart from the main plot and initially appear completely unrelated, but it should somehow tie back to the main plot later in the novel. J.R.R. Tolkien's first installment in the Lord of the Rings trilogy contains a great example of a background prologue. Now, this is especially useful for readers who haven't read the prequel to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, which was published in 1937. This prologue goes into lots of detail about what exactly hobbits are, where they live, and how they behave. It also summarizes the plot of The Hobbit and introduces Bilbo Baggins and his nephew Frodo Baggins, the novel's protagonist. One of the things that makes this prologue work so well is that through the information about hobbits, we start to get a glimpse of how the wider world of the Lord of the Rings works. We learn that it's called Middle-earth, that there are men, elves, and dwarves living in it, and most importantly, that there's a magic ring that's about to reveal its secrets. So it introduces the main characters. It explains how their society and culture works. It explores the wider world and history of the story, and it sets up the conflict the characters will be facing. Now, if you're writing a background prologue, it doesn't have to be as long or as in-depth as Tolkien's. Remember, though, the information you give should be relevant to the story you're about to tell. So focus on one simple event that illuminates how your fictional world works. Prologue number 2, the alternate point of view prologue. Sometimes it's useful to bring in a different narrative perspective in a prologue than the viewpoints you bring into the main story. This type of prologue can add mystery or anticipation to the coming story. This prologue is told by a character other than your main character. For example, Michael Crichton's dinosaur thriller Jurassic Park sets the story in motion with a prologue told from the perspective of Bobby Carter. She's a first aid worker at a remote hospital on an island near Costa Rica. And 2 weeks into her stay, Bobby is called on to give aid to a seriously injured man who was helicoptered in during this heavy rainstorm. She's told that he was involved in a construction accident, but when she inspects his wounds, she realizes they must have been made by some kind of animal. And there are some odd things about this injury. There's a slippery, slimy foam oozing from it, and there's this bad, foul smell. Eventually, the man dies from his injuries, and as he dies, he says something that Bobby believes to be the phrase raptor. And later, she looks up the word raptor only to come across the definition bird of prey. And that's where the prologue ends. This prologue posits questions in her mind. What killed the man, and why does it seem like his death is being covered up? And because the prologue is told from a minor character's perspective, a character with a medical background, as we head into chapter 1, the protagonists are unaware of the danger they're about to encounter. We're aware of the danger, although we still don't know exactly what is causing it. We don't know what kind of bird would inflict this kind of injury, and this adds to the suspense. Now, the only place Bobby Carter appears in the novel is in the prologue. She's a minor character, but her point of view as a doctor is a great way to let us in on what the characters don't yet know before the main plot shows us more people being harmed. So we're prepped for things that start happening in chapter 1 and threaten the characters in which they're totally unaware. In the first chapter, a family is on vacation on a secluded Costa Rican beach, and their 8-year-old daughter, Christina, goes off to search for a sloth on the beach while her parents look on. Now, she's been keeping lists of all the exotic animals she's seen throughout their trip. But when she goes out of view, she's attacked by what the child later describes as a lizard. Now, without the prologue giving us context, we would be just as mystified as the characters here, but we know a little more than they do at this point. So when 8-year-old Christina goes down to the beach, we already expect things to end badly for her. When she sees bird tracks in the sand, then hears chirping in the mangrove thicket, then sees what she thinks is a lizard coming toward her, we anticipate the worst. It's every parent's worst nightmare. Now, you can use this sort of prologue to let the reader see some event coming down the pike, probably something which threatens them in some way, while the rest of the characters remain unaware. This sort of prologue is also useful in historical fiction. For example, maybe the prologue shows an artifact being hidden in the past, and this is an artifact your lead character will discover later on. This brings the world of your book into focus and establishes the question about what this artifact is and why it's important. The alternate point of view prologue should be written in third person, even if the main story is written in first person. Prologue number 3, the thematic prologue. Sometimes there is a particular defining event in your protagonist's life which the reader needs to know to understand the character fully. Usually it's a tragic event. It could be a loss or trauma, some defining event that changed your character's life or sense of self, something that set up your main character's internal struggle, let's say with self-identity or with finding love. This sort of prologue brings us into a powerful event which draws the reader in and makes us connect with the protagonist deeply right from the start. It's effective when written in the first person or third person point of view. For example, Lucy Greeley's memoir, Autobiography of a Face, begins with her describing pony parties she used to do for kids' birthdays when she was 14. Here's an excerpt. Once we reached the party, there was a great rush of excitement. The children, realizing that the ponies had arrived, would come running from the backyard in their silly hats. Their now forgotten balloons bobbing colorfully behind them would fly off in search of some tree or telephone wire. My pleasure at the sight of the children didn't last long, however. I knew what was coming. As soon as they got over the thrill of being near the ponies, they'd notice me. Half my jaw was missing, which gave my face a strange triangular shape, accentuated by the fact that I was unable to keep my mouth completely closed. When I first started doing pony parties, my hair was still short and wispy, still growing in from the chemo. But as it grew, I made things worse by continuously bowing my head and hiding behind the curtain of hair, furtively peering out at the world like some nervous actor. Unlike the actor, though, I didn't secretly relish my audience, and if it were possible, I would have stood behind that curtain forever, my head bent in an external act of deference. I was, however, dependent upon my audience. Their approval or disapproval defined everything for me, and I believed with every cell in my body that approval wasn't written into my particular script. I was 14 years old. So we learned through this prologue that she was 9 years old when she got sick, and that the reason she wanted the job was not for the parties, but to be alone with the horses in the stable afterward because they didn't care how she looked. So having gotten the details of her disfigurement up front, the first chapter then brings her back to 9 years old with a collision in the schoolyard that leads to her cancer diagnosis. The memoir traces her life from 9 years old to adulthood, the pain of disfigurement and feeling ugly, and the several reconstruction surgeries she hoped to fix her appearance and in turn fix her life. But all these operations are unsuccessful, and so she becomes convinced that she'll never know love. So rather than start with the collision in the schoolyard and the gradual realization that she has a rare cancer and that the kids in school taunt her for her disfigured face, she begins with that pain up front and then backtracks to how it all started in chapter 1. And prologue number 4, the flash forward. This sort of prologue shows us the future self of the main character, and then sets the story in motion of how he or she reached that point. It's written in the same point of view and style as the rest of the novel, and the prologue often presents the end of the story first, with the journey towards that point beginning in the first chapter. In this kind of prologue, the character has already lived through the events of the story, and the first chapter will be the beginning of the journey towards that end. In Anna Quinlan's novel, One True Thing, the prologue starts with the protagonist in jail. Jail is not as bad as you might imagine. This is a great opening line, right? Now, we imagine jail is pretty bad, so we read to learn why this narrator thinks otherwise. When I say jail, I don't mean prison. Prison is the kind of place you see in old movies or public television documentaries, those enormous gray places with guard towers at each corner and curly strips of razor wire going round and round like a loop-the-loop atop the high fence. Prison is where they hit the bars with metal spoons, plan insurrections in the yard. Jail was not like that a bit, or at least not the jail in Montgomery County. It was 2 small rooms, both together no bigger than my old attic bedroom in my parents' house, and they did have bars, but they closed by hand, not with the clang of the electric, the remote-controlled, the impregnable. It was an Andy Griffith jail, a Jimmy Stewart jail. Now, at this point, we're willing to accept the character is in an easygoing jail, but we want to know why she's in jail. And after several pages in the prologue, we find out that she is charged with killing her own mother. At the end, I always did what she asked, even though I hated it. I was tired to death of the sour smell of her body and the straw of her hair in the brush and the bedpan and the basin and the pills that kept her crying out, from twisting and turning like the trout do on the banks of the Montgomery River when you've lifted them on the end of the sharp hook and their gills flare in mortal agitation. Okay, so now we're starting to think maybe she did kill her mother against her mother's wishes. And here's how the prologue ends. No matter what the police and the district attorney said, no matter what the papers wrote, no matter what people believed, these years later, the truth is that I did not kill my mother. I only wished I had. Okay, so now our curiosity is high. Did she kill her mother or not? If not her, who did? So through the prologue, we learn a lot about the town. We learn about the community. We learn about the girl's family. We learn her mother was very sick. And we're about to get to chapter 1. Now, Anna Quinlan is a master at manipulating our curiosity. She gives us multiple surprises at every turn, and she entices us to read on. The prologue begins in the aftermath of her mother's death, and then chapter 1 brings us into the story's present when the narrator is asked by her father to quit her job and return home to become a caregiver for her sick mother. Okay, let's recap. A prologue is a dramatized scene or event that's outside the scope of your main storyline. Consider using a prologue when it's beyond the scope of your main storyline. It's crucial for the reader to understand it, and you can't work it elegantly into the main plot. The 4 types of prologues we explored are: number 1, the background prologue; number 2, alternate point of view prologue; number 3, the thematic prologue; and number 4, the flash forward prologue. Here are some tips to keep in mind when writing your prologue. Number 1, keep it short and focused. A good prologue is no more than your typical chapter length. Limit it to one scene or one event. Keep it focused. For example, in Anna Quinlan's novel, One True Thing, the prologue focuses on the protagonist in jail for killing her mother. In Jurassic Park, the prologue focuses on one dramatic event. A man helicoptered to a remote hospital with a mysterious injury. And Lucy Greeley's prologue focuses on the pony parties. Tip number 2. Don't overload your prologue with too much information. Your prologue is not to dump exposition onto your reader. It's not there to explain, but to give us a scene that provides the wider life around your story that helps it make sense as it moves forward. And you want to make sure the prologue is relevant to your story's main action. Tip number 3, don't give away too much too soon. You still want to stoke the reader's curiosity. Your prologue should not be giving away too much of your story. You also don't want to make it too cryptic, so find the balance between giving enough information while still enticing the reader's urge to know more. Jurassic Park's prologue does not give the story away. It doesn't tell us anything about dinosaurs or the science about how they're being genetically recreated. That's all pretty complex, and we don't need to know all this right away. And he doesn't give it away in the prologue. There's still a lot of mystery, but it does introduce us to what's going to follow, and it gives us context for the novel. Tip number 4, make it just as compelling as any first chapter. You want to have an arresting first sentence, and you want to bring contrast, surprise to build tension and conflict into your prologue. And tip number 5, end by planting a question in the reader's mind. What killed the man, and why is his employer covering it up? Did she kill her mother against her mother's wishes? Who did kill her? Now, if the term prologue makes you feel uneasy or resistant, just think of it as a preliminary scene or event your reader needs in order to make sense of what happens as the story moves forward. Just experiment. You don't even have to label it as a prologue. Maybe label it with the place and year that it takes place. I think it's helpful to brainstorm a list of what background information your reader needs in order to understand your story. Then ask yourself if you can weave that information easily into the main storyline. Now, if you're having trouble getting that information into the main story, especially in your opening chapters, then you may want to experiment with writing a prologue or some preliminary scene that prepares us for what follows. So there you have it. I hope this episode gives you some clarity on what a prologue is, whether you need one or not, and how to write one effectively that keeps readers turning the page. If you have a writer friend or two who might benefit from this episode, please share either on your favorite social media platform or just drop the link to this episode into an email or DM. I'd be so grateful to get this episode and the Writer Unleashed podcast in general into the ears of more writers. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Till then, keep writing, and I'll talk to you soon.